Everyone, welcome to Nillumbik's first information session about deer. Thank you everyone for joining us. Today's session is being recorded, so if you have to leave, please don't panic. We'll be able to send everyone a link to the recording after the event. For those of you that are new to Zoom, you should see some buttons near the bottom of your screen. We have the Q&A function enabled, so if you have a question, please type it in there. My role today is to moderate the webinar and in particular the Q&A. I'll do my best to make sure that as many questions as possible are answered. Sometimes I might type an answer into the Q&A, or I might let you know that we'll try to answer it live. If you have any general comments, you can type them into the chat function. This will allow you to converse with others that are here today. And I want to let you know that you have control over where the presenters' faces are on your screen. So you can move our faces around yourselves if they're in the way of any of the text that's showing. Now, I know that there may be a few people that are here today who do hunt and who would like to help landholders out with deer control. That's great, but today is about sharing information about feral deer and providing guidance to help landholders make informed decisions about their property management. We're currently developing up a community deer directory, and the plan is that hunters will be able to provide their contact details through that directory, so please don't provide them today. Equally, there are attendees here today who don't like the idea of hunting any animal, and we totally respect this. Hunting is not the only method of deer control that's available to help to protect properties. However, we will be talking about hunting quite a lot today, although not in graphic detail, as it is one of the only options that's available to reduce deer numbers and their associated impacts. Before we begin today, I'd like to note that our webinar is being hosted on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. Today's presentation is part of our collaborative Community Deer Action project, which is funded by a Communities Environment Grant from the federal government. I'd particularly like to thank our Menzies and Jagga Jagga MPs for their support. My name is Kirsten Reedy, and I'm the Environment Coordinator at Nillumbik Shire Council. Shortly, I'll be joined by Michelle Hanslow, who is an Environment Project Officer at Council. Michelle started working with us 3 years ago as a Biodiversity Officer, but for the last 2 years, she's been managing 3 different deer projects that are focused on deer control, education, and collaboration. So what are we going to cover today? It's going to be a packed session. Firstly, Michelle's going to do a presentation on deer, how they got to Nillumbik and why they're a problem here. She's going to explain the complexities of deer management and share a few examples of actions that have been taken by government, council, community groups and others. She's also going to explain a range of options for property management and control of deer that are possible within a peri-urban area, and some of the issues that you might need to consider. Then we're going to hear from our panel of experts. You'll find out about their involvement with deer, some of the challenges that they face, and some of their recommendations that they have for deer control across Nillumbik. I'm going to introduce them now so that you can think about what questions you might like to ask them specifically via the Q&A function on your laptops or devices. So we've got, first of all, Council's 2 deer contractors, who are Jake Haddad from VPAC and Richard Francis from Abzico, and they've both been working with us since October last year. We'll have David Laird, who is the hunting manager from the Sporting Shooters Association of Australia, and he also manages their Farmer Assist and Conservation Pest Management programs. We've got Arta Mature from the Middle Yarra Landcare Network, who has been coordinating a group of Greenwich neighbours in Manningham who are working collaboratively to undertake professional deer control across their properties. Mike Hall is from the Cardinia Deer Coalition, which is a group of farmers that are assisting other farmers with deer control. Ashley Henderson is a volunteer deer shooter who can share with you, she can share what you can expect if you bring in a volunteer Sporting Shooters Association member. And we've got Patricia Gibbons, who's a landholder from Strathewen, who has had a deer harvesting company assist her and her neighbours with deer control, and she's actually been paid for this. So unfortunately, our Parks Victoria Ranger from Kinglake National Park had to pull out at the last moment, and our local Victoria Police Firearms Officer would have liked to have participated but was unable to. So if you've got any questions for either of those two people, if you type them into the Q&A, we'll try and follow up with them and get back to you. So after hearing very briefly from each of these panel members, we'll be opening the floor to questions from yourselves via the Q&A Zoom function. Today is designed to get us all thinking and talking about deer with each other and later on with our neighbours. The webinar will officially end at 4 o'clock, but we'll be happy to stay on for a little bit longer to answer more questions if that's helpful. Now I'm going to hand over to Michelle, who's going to start us off with a quick poll so that we can all find out a little bit more about who's joined us here this afternoon. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Kirsten, for that lovely introduction. Yes, I am going to start with a little poll just to find out where you're all from. Let's have a look here. Just one moment. Okay. Hopefully this should appear on everyone's screen. And I'm going to give you a little moment just to answer those questions about what your connection to Nillumbik is, where you find yourself, whether you live here or work here or just like to visit. What your current knowledge is of today's topic, which is deer and their management. Do you think the deer are a problem? And where do you live? Just trying to get a sense for whether people are local, live in the city, live in the country, and maybe experience a few more issues with deer. All right, that's going up nicely. I can see all the results coming in there. Got about 50% voted. I'll give it a couple more seconds. Hopefully everyone can see the poll. Sometimes we have issues if you're on an iPad or something like that. So apologies if you have any issues with the poll itself. Okay. Oh, nearly there. Takes a little while, doesn't it? All right. Well, we've got about 80% that have voted now, so I'll just end that poll and I'll share the results with you. So it's fantastic. About half of the attendees today are from Nillumbik, and we've had over 200 registrations, so there's probably quite a few people here from Nillumbik. Current knowledge, most people got a pretty fair understanding. That's understandable. Overwhelmingly, people think that deer are a problem. Okay, well, I don't have any work to do here today. And the majority of people here are in the green wedge. Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. Okay. Just waiting for my slide to move on. Okay, so now we know a bit more about each other. Let's find out about these deer. So deer are native to countries all across the world. In fact, they're from almost every continent except Australia. In their homelands, they're preyed upon by tigers and other animals, and for the most part, that helps to keep their populations pretty stable. Deer are crepuscular or nocturnal, and they're ungulate ruminants. I just love saying those words. But basically what this means is they come out at dusk or at night time, they have hard hooves, and they've got 4 stomach chambers so they can chew on their cud a bit like cows. So how did they come to be here in Australia? Finding my mouse would work. Acclimatisation societies introduced 16 different deer species into Australia during the 19th century for hunting, farming, sport, and for their aesthetic beauty. This is a plaque that can be, oops, I'll go back a step. It's a plaque that can be found in Kuirup, which commemorates the release of Sambar deer there in 1868. It reads, the Sambar are now benignly established throughout the forested mountain country of southeast Australia. Deer have spread out across Australia as their populations increased, but also as a result of human interference. We've had quite a lot of assisted dispersal with farm fences being cut and illegal releases of deer into good hunting areas. Many of the recent releases have been attributed to the collapse of the deer farming industry, which happened around 2003. They're pretty tasty meats. And there's now several deer species which are established wild across all of eastern Australia, not just the southeast, including a few up north. There are 6 deer species fully established and living wild in Victoria, and not just in the forested mountain areas. Got the fallow, hog, red and sambar deer being the most common, but there's also chital and rusa deer also. Sambar are the most widespread deer species, and most of these came from Sri Lanka and were released in Victoria at Mount Sugarloaf, which is in Kinglake National Park, so already local to us, back in the 1860s, and at the Cooey-Rup Swamp, which I mentioned before, and later on at a couple of other locations across Victoria. So this map shows where the 4 main deer species are generally found. The red deer, which are the red dots, they're found in the Grampians region. The sambar are the green dots, and they're found across the Alpine region and Gippsland. Hog deer are down by the coast and Wilson's Prom, and fallow deer are the little purple dots that are scattered all across Victoria. Fun fact, a small group of sambar actually survived on French Island for many years. That's down in here. And individual deer from that population were known to swim back and forwards to the mainland. I'd just like to point out how big these deer are. That's a 6-foot person as a comparison. So deer have been in Nillumbik for many years at pretty low densities, but there's been a steady, noticeable increase in the numbers, particularly since the 2009 Black Saturday fires. Many deer would have been killed in those fires along with our native animals, but some will have escaped to the unburnt areas. It's generally agreed that the deer moved back into Kinglake National Park, eating all the delicious new plant growth that was regenerating in there and began breeding, whilst others began moving through the forested gullies down through the Warrandyte Kinglake Nature Conservation Reserve, all the way down to the Yarra River. Other deer most likely will have also moved into Nillumbik along the Yarra through from Yarra to the Yarra Valley. Deer probably have a home range that they hang around in. We don't exactly know the extent of that range, but they have areas for bedding, covered areas and open grazing areas nearby where they feed. But they disperse out of those areas when there's a lack of feed, overcrowding, or the males are seeking some new rut areas. And so with the patchwork of forests and grazing areas, as well as water from farm dams, rivers and creeks, Nillumbik's green wedge is probably highly attractive to deer. Deer are also being seen far more regularly in urban areas, even in Eltham's town square, behind the shops. In general, they do keep pretty close to tree cover for protection, but sometimes they get caught out and have been found in some pretty unusual places, running down the Eastern Freeway, along the Ringwood Bypass. They've been found in a kindergarten and even in a funeral home, which is this image here. Got a pop quiz. See if you know what this deer call might be. Sounds a bit like a cow to me, quite frankly, or something very odd. It's a red deer, and it's roaring. Here's another example. Just sounds like a bull. They live in herds, which are dominated. Keeps interrupting me. Goodness me. Oh. You ready? They're pretty adaptable animals, but they prefer undulating woodlands with grassy areas and plenty of waterways, which sounds a lot like Nillumbik. They are mainly grazers, but they feed on woody trees and shrubs, as well as grasses, sedges and forbs, which are little herbaceous plants. Top speed, a red deer stag can run at 70 k's an hour. Try outrunning that. They can clear a 2-metre high fence from standing position, or even up to 3 metres when running, and they live about 20 years. Oh, I paused that again. We also have fallow deer in Nillumbik, and they're generally known for their pretty spots. Hope everyone can hear those sounds. Another unusual one. So these are pretty variable in their appearance, but they're pretty distinctive with those palmate-shaped antlers that they've got there. And their lifespan's much shorter than red deer, around 12 to 16 years. They can run at a maximum of 50 k's over short distances and jump 1.75 metres high and 5 metres in length. These animals are amazing. They graze on a wide variety of grasses, herbs and shrubs, which in Australia includes banksias and wattles. Their preferred habitat is mixed woodland and open grassland, which ranges from cool and wet to hot and dry habitats. Again, plenty of this type of habitat in Nillumbik, but they're currently isolated in just a pretty small area around the Plenty Gorge. Oh, done it again. Okay, Sambar deer. Awesome honk. Great echo. Scares the pants off you when you're not expecting it. In their home countries, which is India and Asia, their conservation status is listed as vulnerable. I don't think they're vulnerable here. They are our largest feral deer living in Australia, living up to 20 years. The males can grow to 2.4 metres long and can weigh up to 300 kilograms. They breed year round and populations are capable of doubling every 3 years. And their numbers tend to have a little spike in the increase when they move into new territories, which have got no competition for them. Sambar are mainly solitary animals. They can easily swim with just their heads poking up above the water. And in that way, they can cross the Yarra River back and forwards as it suits them. They're really adaptable animals and they live in difficult, complex terrain, but often at the edges of farmlands. They have been known to inhabit heathland, woodland, dry forest and rainforest and are capable of causing immense damage in the wet forests of the Dandenong Ranges. It's proving a bit problematic for the lyrebirds there, which rely on those wetlands. They are found all across Nillumbik, but as they're cryptic species and hide really well, they might be right in front of you, but you just can't see them. So, are they a problem? Well, based on sighting reports, resident complaints and the damage noted by council officers who are out in the field, deer numbers are quickly increasing in Nillumbik. And depending on where they're found, they might be viewed as a pest or they might just be an exciting novelty or a tourist attraction even. Council's concern is that without management to keep the numbers low, we will see increasing damage as we will now look at. So to start with, deer eat a lot. Sambar deer have been recorded to eat 3 to 4 kilograms of dry weight per day, which is twice as much as a wombat and 10 times more than a swamp wallaby. It's been calculated that Sambar could consume between 6 and 30 tonnes of vegetation per month. Deer cause damage to plants through trampling, rubbing, browsing and grazing. They eat all types of plants at all life stages. So that's seedlings, adults, flowers and seeds. And that can prevent natural regeneration and has big impacts on revegetation projects as well. Standing on their back legs, the deer can rip branches off up to a height of 2 metres. Plant diversity is greatly reduced with deer presence. These photos here are of Boomers Reserve. They have regular deer sightings there. This photo at the top left is a fenced part of the reserve and the bottom photo is an unfenced part, and you can see a distinct lack of ground and mid-storey plants. So similar impacts from deer are being seen throughout the Green Wedge, particularly around North Warrandyte, Eltham, Plenty and other peri-urban areas. And both flora and fauna are starting to feel the effects. Our little Eltham copper butterfly is surviving in small isolated patches of bushland in Eltham, and it's now facing another risk. Deer are over-browsing the Basaria plants, which are the butterfly larvae's main food source. And we've actually got an event as part of Spring Outdoors, the butterfly, the ant and the bush. So if you want to find out more about the Eltham copper butterfly, tune into that. Another secondary impact from deer is on our tiny orchids. Many of these, there's a picture of them there, many of these rely on pollination by native bees and wasps, and they feed on some pretty specific plant species, for example, peas, and not the ones you eat. And when those plants are eaten and there's no flowers available, the wasps stop visiting and then the orchids aren't pollinated. Of course, they could also be just trampled or eaten by the deer as well. And antler rubbing of the trees, which is a pretty good indication that you've got deer in the area, even if you haven't seen the deer themselves, might just appear to be cosmetic, but this rubbing can actually kill a tree by ring barking it. And in East Gippsland, some plant species are under threat just from antler rubbing alone. And obviously this damage increases with the number of deer present, although home gardeners in Nillumbik can attest to the fact that you only need one deer to completely destroy a garden that's been nurtured for 20 or 30 years. It's heartbreaking. The hard hooves that deer have cause damage to our soils, causing compaction or erosion, depending on the soil type. And their wallowing and trampling activities can degrade wetlands and waterways, reducing the clarity and destroying fish and invertebrate habitats. This teeny tiny little frog, it's the southern toadlet, sitting on his finger, is already vulnerable due to its limited habitat that it's got remaining, but it's being further impacted by deer through trampling of their breeding sites and drainage areas as well. On an economic side, deer are damaging orchards, strawberry crops and vineyards. They've all had damage experienced in Nillumbik and across the Yarra Valley more widely. Entire year's crops have been decimated, which causes huge economic losses. Deer are capable of transmitting some diseases through to other stock and less often to people. I think examples I've heard have been Lyme disease from ticks and Jones disease. There's a number. And in the US, they've got something called chronic wasting disease. They call it the zombie deer disease. We haven't got that here. It's okay. Recent studies have also proven that deer have the ability to spread weeds or prune them, as this photo of the blackberry from one of our properties where we're doing some work shows. And finally, there's the interactions with people. There's an increasing number of vehicle collisions with deer being reported in Nillumbik and surrounding areas, and deer are being regularly sighted on roads all across outer Melbourne, but they've also been seen as close to the city as Kew. Sambar deer are huge and have been known to be aggressive. We've had residents tell us that they're scared to go walking for fear of disturbing a deer. And finally, a secondary impact of deer is the problem of illegal shooting or poaching. Trespass and leaving remains of animals behind is unwanted and illegal. And reports of any such activities, should you notice them, should be reported to Victoria Police immediately and also to the Game Management Authority so that they can investigate. So there's a number of issues with deer in our environment, and we don't even have that many deer here that we know of. So maybe we don't need to take any action. Well, 2018 draft Victorian Deer Management Strategy estimated that we may have up to 1 million deer. That's across the 4 species in Victoria, but it's only a best guess, and our local deer population numbers we know even less about. We can monitor fairly easily for presence or absence using signs such as scats, tracks or ring barking or sightings to tell us where the deer are, but it's harder to tell how many. Monitoring damage or changes to vegetation might be a better tool. It might not tell you the density of deer, but it might indicate whether you have too many deer in the area and whether we're nearing the maximum carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is the number of a particular species that can be supported by an environment. So as the resources become scarce, animal population growth may slow or even crash, as this little diagram shows. And that can affect not just the deer numbers, but also our local native animals as well, as scarcity of resources increases. And the issue with carrying capacity being reached is that sometimes the vegetation doesn't get a chance to recover sufficiently to begin supporting those animals after a while. So how many deer is too many is the million-dollar question. Some habitats might be able to support a large number of deer, but a critically important habitat site or a small patch of vegetation like those we find in Nillumbik might only be able to cope with 1 deer or no deer at all. Our peri-urban environments are already subject to pressures from climate change and land clearing for development, which is managed through our planning scheme, and deer are often seen as just the last straw. Because deer populations can and will continue to increase if we do nothing, Nillumbik Shire Council is really keen to get on top of the problem before the numbers become too high and are then unmanageable. Here's what it could look like in more locations around Nillumbik if no action were taken. You might have seen this back on the news in July. This is Melbourne Water's Sugarloaf Reservoir, which I might add is very much closed to hunting. It's fenced off, so you can go in there and look for them, but that's about it. So now we know about the impacts caused by deer, let's have a look and see whether they're a pest or protected. So across Australia, deer are classified differently. In Queensland, Northern Territory, South Australia and Western Australia, they are classified as pest species. In September last year, deer were delisted as a game animal on private land only in New South Wales, and Tasmania lists their fallow deer as partly protected wildlife, and they're controlled in order to protect their grazing lands. But they have limits on the stag numbers that we can take in order to maintain the deer as a game hunting resource. And in Victoria, it's equally complex. Deer are listed as protected wildlife under the Wildlife Act, but under the same Act, they are unprotected on private land where they're causing damage, unprotected on some Crown land, and 6 species are further classified as game animals under the game regulations. National Parks Act obliges Parks Vic to control introduced fauna, which includes deer in their state and national parks. So essentially they're regarding them as a pest in those situations. And they also set aside 8.5 million hectares of public land for hunting. So therefore they're listed as a game species. And finally, under the Catchment and Land Protection Act, only the deer species that are not yet established are listed as a pest. So you got that? It's not complicated. But regardless of all that, based on all these rules, deer can be removed from public land where recreational hunting is permitted with a game hunting licence, and that's daytime hunting. They can be removed from public land with an authority to control wildlife, which is issued by DELP, and that also includes council land, and that is generally undertaken as nighttime control. And private land where the deer are a problem, they can be removed with a signed landholder agreement, which is under the Governor and Council Unprotection of Deer Order. And that allows control at nighttime and using spotlight, which is more effective, or nighttime hunting is more effective. And finally, private land with the landholder permission still allows for recreational hunting, and that is during daylight hours. So whilst deer can be controlled on most land, although some might argue that there's not enough public land set aside for hunting, it's definitely a little complicated. So, since there's so many acts and regulations involved, there are a number of agencies and individuals who are in some way responsible for overseeing deer. Here's a few. So we've got state government agencies that look after relevant policy and legislation, which includes wildlife, game and pest animal policies, animal welfare and safe food handling. There are those that oversee hunting activities, such as the Game Management Authority. They look after the licensing of game hunters and enforcement of hunting laws, and Victoria Police, who issue the firearms licences. They enforce the firearms laws and they allocate public place permits, which I'll go into a bit more later. Then there's those that are responsible for pest or feral animal management on their own land, which includes DELP and Parks Victoria. And we've got the private landholders. These are probably the most important land manager in Nillumbik for reducing deer numbers, as the land generally has more areas which are suitable for control. It's pretty hard to control deer in really thick bushland. And whilst private landholders are permitted to control deer, it's an option and it's not a responsibility. And then we have local councils, and we manage problem deer on council-owned land where we can, and we support landholders with deer management and property protection. So we provide advice and financial support to landholders through our Land Management Incentive Program grants, which cover fencing and some control, particularly when there's clusters of properties participating, as landscape scale control is definitely more effective, and that's the same way that we would control fox and rabbits, for instance. So I've explained why deer are an issue and where we can remove them. So what else has been done? There's probably more action being taken than you might expect. For starters, landholders have been controlling problem deer on their properties for some time. We don't know how many deer have been culled in Nillumbik or where. It would be good to know. We have accredited volunteer shooting, and that certainly accounts for part of that private land deer control, but there's probably more recreational hunting on farms and in state forests of deer, and that's outside of Nillumbik because we don't have those state forests. I'll let David Laird explain to you how groups like Sporting Shooters and Australian Deer Association can assist landholders in providing volunteers to control problem deer, as well as they provide advice on fencing and deterrents and other control. The government has started to take notice. In 2018, the federal government held a Senate inquiry into the impact of feral pig, deer and goats. The federal government also works with the states and territories to develop strategies, undertake research and fund key management activities. But as yet, there's no threat abatement plan for deer. The draft Victorian Deer Management Strategy was prepared by the Victorian State Government in 2018, and we're still waiting for the release of a finalised version. Maybe this year, hopefully. So although the draft didn't quite hit the mark in a lot of areas from Council's perspective, we are hopeful that the final version will include a strategy for peri-urban deer management. Because at the moment, local councils are really just trying to figure out what to do on our own, and we are not deer specialists. State government also provides grant funding to protect biodiversity or agricultural values from deer, and many councils are using grants from the state government to help manage their deer populations. States recognised that deer are a problem and have listed the reduction in biodiversity of native vegetation by Sambar as a potentially threatening process under the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act, which is our threatened species legislation in Victoria. Landcare and Friends groups have been particularly proactive in deer control and vegetation protection. They've implemented a number of ground shooting programs as well as fencing exclosures, I think we call them, to exclude deer from sensitive vegetation and also to protect any re-veg projects that they're undertaking. Jumping Creek Landcare Group has a great program that they're running with the support of Manningham Council, and I'll let Arta tell you a little bit more about that in the panel presentation later on. Parks Victoria have a deer control program in the Kinglake National Park, so just to the top of Nillumbik, which uses the Australian Deer Association as well as some professional contractors. They've got control planned for a couple of local reserves within Nillumbik, and across Victoria there are some major deer control projects occurring which are taking advantage of the more open forests post-fire. It's easier to control them when there's less undergrowth, but it's also a critical time to do it now because that's going to protect those regenerating forests. Melbourne Water, they manage large areas of land across the state, but in our region, got two large reservoirs, and they've got control of deer either underway or planned at both the Yan Yean and Sugarloaf reservoirs. Victorian National Parks Association struggling advocate for deer control as an essential way to protect national parks. And finally, we have Nillumbik Shire Council, and we are involved with deer, with management of deer through the Yarra Catchment Deer Network and the Eastern Region Pest Animal Network, who have actually released a pest animal strategy recently, which certainly includes deer. And these groups discuss management strategies and prioritise control areas. And they include representatives from all land tenures, so government agencies, councils, public land managers, and community representatives, often through Landcare. So got a wide base to have those discussions. Council often installs biodiversity exclusion fences, predominantly at our significant reserves, just to protect a patch of threatened plants species from deer, and also other grazing animals too. We're running two on-ground deer control projects, the Sugarloaf Link project, which I'll talk about in a minute, and also Kangaroo Ground Deer Control, which is an extension, I guess, of that Sugarloaf project. And we also have this project, the Collaborative Community Deer Action, which is focused on education and information. So Council takes an asset-based approach. We focus on protecting high-quality vegetation and agricultural assets, and ideally, we'd like to prevent the spread of deer into other areas through the creation of a containment line of sorts. We just need to work out where to put that. So Sugarloaf Link project is my baby. It's a 3-year project. It's funded by a biodiversity response planning grant from DELP. And a major part of that project is a 2-year pilot to trial effectiveness of deer control in peri-urban areas. I've provided a map there showing the project area which surrounds the Sugarloaf Reservoir. Covers an area of about 41 square kilometres, which is about 10% of Nillumbik. And this area was chosen because of high biodiversity values, the proximity to the Yarra, which runs along the southern border, and also a proximity to nearby deer control programs. So the Jumping Creek program across the Yarra, projects underway in Sugarloaf Reservoir and also in the nearby Kinglake National Park. So the aim was to complement those works and create a control line, cutting deer off and preventing them coming from Kinglake, coming all the way down and reaching the Yarra via that Warrandyte-Kinglake corridor. And ideally, stop them crossing over the river into Manningham. The area's got a mix of bushland residential lots, farms, water catchment and conservation reserves. So it's pretty representative of many of the other green wedge areas. It was really popular, surprisingly. 98 out of 300 properties in the project area signed up for deer control. That's 30%, which is a crazy high rate of participation for a council project. And there was a lot of interest from the Bend of Islands Environmental Living Zone. Just popped a little picture there of the great people from there. Contrary to what might be assumed for a group of greenies, there was a lot of interest from them. In fact, a huge desire for deer control to help protect local flora and fauna. And I just want to say a big thank you to all those people. But they're really involved in their environment and they recognise the damage that the deer can cause. So they know it's important to do something. The majority of the properties that signed up to participate were quite small. It's the orange properties down here. The pink properties were also signed up to. But because of the size of those properties, we had expected we'd do a lot of on-foot stalking because they're too big for vehicle operations. But instead, our contractors chose to focus their works on about 15 of the larger properties, which had plenty of fringe country. So that is the interface between forest and grazing areas, and they believed that would provide for maximum productivity. So they're the pink areas on the map. And so they are either a cluster of smaller properties or the larger size properties. Also, hopefully visible on the map are the green boundaries showing the Parks Victoria reserves within the project area. So one downside of having so many properties to work across was the amount of coordination and communication required to let everyone know when works are happening, as well as a huge number of site visits and safety plans for the contractors to prepare. So our contractors have been amazing. They're highly skilled, totally professional, really helpful, and they've been really great at communicating with myself and the other residents about all of their plans. They were required to have public place permits for all the properties where they're working, and that meant that they needed to prepare shoot plans, which are approved by Victoria Police before they can undertake any works. So these permits, I did mention them before, they're generally not available to recreational hunters. I'm sure there's some exceptions, but it's a bit of a barrier to work in some of these areas. They used a combination of techniques depending on the topography and access, including vehicle-based, stalking on foot and static hides. Although with those, you've got to wait for the deer to come to you, so they might not be as productive. There's some images of some of the project area. You can see that it's quite hilly, but also has some really steep blocks with thick vegetation making access quite difficult. So the results from the project have been really good. Since October last year, and we've still got one more year to go, more than 200 deer have been removed. So the contractors and the residents have started reporting that they're seeing less deer, and the contractors are needing to adjust their approach to ensure they continue to be productive. So learnings, this is a huge learning curve for council officers, mainly me. So here's some of what we learned. Hopefully you can apply it to your projects. Maximising productivity should be the focus when wanting to reduce deer at a landscape scale. So that meant that instead of focusing works around those high biodiversity areas that we wanted to protect, you instead look for more productive areas that are outside those, so the fringe country. So areas where it's safe to shoot and you get more bang for your buck. The other thing we learned is that harvesting is time consuming. I would say about a quarter of the time maybe is spent removing animals from the properties. But it does mean that the animal is not wasted. But some of the sites are annoyingly steep, and that makes access in wet weather particularly pretty difficult for these retrievals. The other learning was that having adjoining or large properties involved really improves results, because if the deer move to the next property, the controller can follow rather than just going, oh, the deer's on the other side of the fence. So this really demonstrated to council the benefit of having groups of landholders working collaboratively. Another learning was that commercial shooters can remove large numbers of deer really quickly, and that knockdown effect we think is really beneficial, and we recommend starting any big projects in this way. You can follow it up with some volunteer shooting or just very occasional small numbers being taken out. That will probably keep your numbers down long term. And we need to use knowledge of deer behaviour to inform our works. So these small residential bush blocks that I mentioned that were in the Bend of Islands, the residents do see deer, but they're mainly transient, moving through as they go to find feeding areas. So you might have to wait a while if you were wanting to find a deer, which is not particularly cost effective if you're being paid by the hour. And deer species have different behaviours, and these can be exploited to maximise productivity, but I'll let the contractors potentially explain that, because it's not my area of expertise. So has the project made a difference? Is it possible to reduce deer numbers? Well, locally we know we've made a difference. Can we repeat it across all of Nillumbik? Well, it's hard to say yet. There's a number of unknowns. We don't have full details on the numbers, densities and locations of deer across all of Nillumbik. We know that public place permits are likely to be required in many areas, and that might then necessitate the use of a commercial shooter, and that comes at a cost. And we don't yet know what will happen post-control. Will we have a rebound in numbers, and how long will it be until new deer move in? But what we do know is that without control, deer numbers will increase and the damage that we're seeing to the environment will worsen. So what are the options for landholders? So there's currently 3 main avenues for property management and control of deer. The first is property protection, so fencing and deterrents. Second is reducing deer numbers, and the third is habitat modification. I've put in there some of the things you might be trying to protect, as you need to think about what option will work best based on what it is you're wanting to protect from the deer. Now, we are going to be running separate and specific training sessions for both fencing and control of deer separately, so you can ask questions that relate to your property directly, and hopefully where we can all just chat, not just me blabbing on and the attendees in the background. So we want to be able to all talk together and share our ideas. So for now, I'm just going to briefly touch on each of these options, tell you some things you need to consider, and maybe when those options might work best for you. It's also worth noting that I haven't listed trapping, immunocontraception, baiting, or the use of crossbows. They might have been listed in the survey if you've completed that, but we can perhaps discuss these in the Q&A if you're interested in why we haven't considered these. So fencing is the best solution to keep deer away from plants. As we saw from the photos of Boomers Reserve, which is in Panton Hill, fences have a noticeable positive effect. However, we can't fence off all of Nillumbik. Fences require ongoing maintenance. Deer fences also tend to exclude the native wildlife, and they need to be mega big, over 2 metres tall, to stop the deer jumping over or pushing them over. They work best for small areas, so we would recommend less than 50 by 50 metres in size, and they do often need a permit from council depending on where you live. Deterrents I have included here are probably only of short-term benefit if they work at all. Like most animals, deer get used to sights and sounds that are unusual, and deterrents are intended to be scaring the deer away. So if they stop working after a while, that's not much help. But they're designed to affect their senses. So sight, so you might use sensor lights or tinsel or something like that to make them wonder what they're seeing. Sound, like the bird scarers, or an ultrasonic device. Smell, so something that's stinky, or a predator scent like urine, which can make them fearful. Taste, like you might spray something on your plants, or you might grow plants that are supposedly distasteful. And touch, such as an electric wire. A resident I spoke to recently said that she tried sensor lights to keep deer away, but all it did was show them where the food was. Funny, not funny. An example of a combination of both deterrents and fences is temporary electrified fencing strands, and they might be effective in breaking the habits of deer walking through a particular area, and it might direct them away from sensitive areas. And I believe there are some trials being undertaken of this locally, so we wait for the results of that. So if you do decide that you'd like to help reduce deer numbers, there are some things you need to consider if you're in a peri-urban area. I have no doubt that there's a few hunters here today thinking, just let me come and shoot your deer, but it's just not that straightforward. Deer are found in pretty much every suburb of Nillumbik, and whether it's possible to do control in those locations is another matter. So those smaller property sizes that we have mean that there could be a number of issues. Firearm noise complaints from neighbours, deer running onto the neighbour's property where you can't shoot them, and safety. So safety is managed in Nillumbik through the use of the public place permits, which are issued by Victoria Police. And these are required in many areas of Nillumbik because of the proximity to houses and people. So whether a permit is required is not determined by a planning scheme zone like rural farming or residential, that sort of thing. It's far more complicated. So always contact your local district firearms officer to check that you're allowed to shoot on a particular property. And also to note that the unprotection of deer order, which allows you to shoot problem deer on private land, doesn't override the firearms regulations. And there will be many properties where you can't shoot without that public place permit. So make sure you know about it. In regard to noise, we highly recommend that you or your deer controller let your neighbours know what you plan to do and when. So there's nothing worse than hearing a gunshot at night and not knowing what is going on. You need to be respectful of neighbours and restrict the extent of your shooting to only what's necessary. So we probably recommend that the recreational hunting that happens in state forests well away from families is probably the best way to provide positive impact for Nillumbik residents, but without those stresses that might come along with it. Suppressors, or silencers as you might know them, can help a bit, but contrary to what you might have seen in the movies, the sound is only reduced by about 30% or so your neighbours will still hear it. And to get around some of these issues with the small property sizes, we recommend you form an action group, cluster group, cooperative group with your neighbours. So for one, you have neighbours who support the control activities on your side. And also these clusters give you an overall larger area to work with. So you reduce the chance that the deer will be on the wrong side of the fence when your hunter comes to visit. Or controller, I use the words interchangeably. Next, you should know your hunter. Many landholders are anxious about having someone they don't know on their property with a firearm. So you need to have a good trusting relationship between a landholder and a hunter. So services such as the Farmer Assist program let the landholder select the hunter rather than a landholder having some random person knocking on their door, which can be a bit intimidating. So a landholder that allows a shooter, a volunteer or contractor onto their land should make sure that they are fully understanding of what's going to be happening, who will be coming, when, how often, where they'll be operating, what methods they'll use, and what they'll do with the remains. Permits and licenses should all be verified as well. So remember that if planning control of problem deer on private property, then the landholder permission form needs to be signed. I can show you a copy of that later. And it needs to be carried by the controller. And if hunting at night, the controller should do a daytime visit beforehand to assess any risks and provide you with a safety plan. So there are plenty more things that you need to consider, and we are developing some guides and checklists for landholders wishing to engage a deer controller. We're also really keen to ensure that anyone wanting to do shooting in Nillumbik is fully aware of the potential impacts they have on local residents. So we'd love to meet you and have a chat. Okay, population. Next, you need to consider how many deer are in your area and how many you need removed. Is it just a couple or is it more than 10? Will your shooter be happy to take a lot of deer quickly, or will they only do like one deer every couple of months? And will that make a difference? Cost. How much are you prepared to pay? Some contractors charge per deer rate, others charge per hour. A volunteer shooter is free. In fact, if they charge you a fee, then their volunteer club insurance won't cover them. So it is worth asking about insurance as well. So just to make sure that any damages that do occur will be covered. Land tenure. There is no recreational hunting in the Parks Victoria reserves in Nillumbik, nor in council reserves or in the Melbourne water properties. So you'll need to have permission from the landholder to be allowed in almost all areas of Nillumbik. Deer don't respect land tenure and boundaries, and it's pretty much essential that when works are undertaken that it's done on both private and public lands. Otherwise the deer will very quickly work out where the safe places are and they'll hide out there. And vegetation and location. From what I've spoken about today, hopefully you now understand that deer will mainly spend their days hiding in bushland, and they'll venture out at night to feed in the more open areas, but still close by to that tree cover so they can run and hide if they get spooked. And that's important to keep in mind when we want to prioritise areas for control. Here's an example of a pretty optimal deer control location with both grazing and bedding areas, and the natural contours there make it really safe for control. It is in fact one of our control locations. In open areas like these with few houses, volunteer and recreational shooters might be permitted, but subject to the district firearms officer approval. However, it's also worth noting that the Yarra is right here too, and that's a location where you'd find walkers and canoeists regularly, so you need to take extra care. I'd also like to point out that in the bottom left of the map here, we've got much smaller properties. This is the North Warrandyte area, and I know that plenty of deer move through these properties and they're quite problematic, but the topography and number of houses there make it pretty impractical, unsafe, and definitely unproductive for deer control. And here's the other extreme. It's an Eltham. It's definitely where deer have been sighted, and it's almost impossible to do control here. So in this scenario, you'd be better to find a location nearby where there's more space and control is practical. And control on larger properties will benefit these smaller properties by reducing overall numbers of deer in the area, and it's safer and more productive. And then cost sharing maybe between the larger and smaller properties would be nice, rather than placing the burden of cost on the landholder where the control is occurring. Yeah. And also in general, the ability to manage the deer infestation over a landscape scale and spread out the areas where you're doing control, rather than by having a property by property approach where you're having complaints, will deliver better results. Okay, so if possible, don't let the deer be wasted. Recreational shooters usually take the deer that they shoot to eat, and that's great when animals can be utilised for personal consumption by the hunter. Since 2018, approved harvesters can take a deer to a licensed Prime Safe approved meat processing facility, otherwise known as a knackery or abattoir, and these deer can then be used for human consumption, pet food, or rendered for fertiliser, depending on where you're taking them. And there are Australian standards and guidelines that have to be followed to ensure that meat is handled hygienically. Harvesting to make money is not a reason to undertake a cull. Culling should only be considered when deer are causing a problem. Shouldn't be a money-making venture. But harvesting is beneficial when you're removing a large number of animals and it's not feasible to be taking all the deer for personal use. And it also means that you've got another option than leaving an animal to rot on site. Harvesting enables a hunter to be paid per kilo of deer by a knackery, And that can allow a property owner to get free or subsidised control or even be paid. It's worth noting hunters are not allowed to donate, trade or sell deer products. All sales must be done through a licensed processing facility. So we covered property protection and reducing deer numbers. Final option is managing deer through modifying their habitat. So removing blackberry and other non-Indigenous cover, that reduces the places where the deer can hide and breed, and it has the added benefit of also being weed controlled, and it reduces the harbour for foxes and rabbits too. So get that blackberry gone. Of course, there is also plenty of other vegetation that the deer will find to hide in as alternatives, and clearing all vegetation is not a solution. Preventing access to artificial stock water points might encourage deer to find somewhere else to feed and thus reduce deer numbers in your area. And then finally, strategic fencing that aims to either exclude deer from sensitive vegetation and assets or to exclude access to areas which might harbour them. So maybe patches of burgon or other thick vegetation. All right, so we have covered what control and protection options are available, and we can assist you with some of that. We can provide funding for some of these management actions through our land management incentive program. Deer control and management ideally should be strategic and implemented at a landscape scale. So with the aim to reduce damage in hotspot areas. And ideally, we'd like to be able to identify the travel routes that deer take and cut them off before they reach any significant sites, whether biodiversity or agricultural assets. But in order for council to determine these hotspots, we need to know where the deer are. We need data. And the best and easiest way I found is to record deer with DeerScan, and you can get that on your smartphone or online. I feel like I'm doing a real plug. It's super easy to use. You don't have to know what species you're seeing, just say that it's a deer, and you don't have to take a photo, and that's really beneficial too, because sometimes it's really hard to catch them with the camera. But you need to see the deer first, obviously. So you might see them in person, but a wildlife camera set up on parts of your property that maybe you can't see at night time near a dam or a tree rub site is perfect for capturing sightings of such nocturnal visitors, both feral and native. So you might get a few surprises about what you've got. I will arrange a monitoring workshop for those who want to find out how to identify deer, deer signs, maybe do some scat counts and monitor changes to vegetation. Might be a good uni project for someone if you're looking for a research topic. And I also want to point out, you don't need to worry about the privacy of the DeerScan data and how it might be used. It's very well protected and only available to council officers like myself or other biosecurity agencies. And in fact, this map of Australia is shows you what you can see if you log in. That's as far in as you can zoom. The only thing you can zoom into are your own records. And the map on the right shows the DeerScan sightings that have been recorded since 2015 in Nillumbik only. And the orange dots are complaints or comments that I've received at council. And we've also got a couple of ad hoc records that we've received from council officers. The blue sites, the little aqua dots, they are control sites, and we know there's heaps more than what is being shown here. But that's okay, but we'd love to know where the control is occurring. And we've had 272 sighting submissions in those 5 years, recording 575 deer. And the vast majority of those have been over the last 12 months, and probably as a result of me hassling people to do it. So it's probably skewed because it's only those people that I've spoken to that are recording the data. So we've got lots of blank areas where we've got no data, but we know they're there. I mean, it's not nearly enough data from these points for us to yet make informed decisions. So once we know where the hotspots are, we can better assist you. But in the meantime, here's a number of ways that council can continue to help you with deer issues. We've got a number of fact sheets, and we put these on our webpage for the project. It's the Collaborative Community Deer Action page on the council website, and we'll be regularly updating that with resources for you. We provide training and advice. Today's a bit of an example. And we can undertake property visits. Either myself or our land management officer can come out and have a look at your property to determine whether there's areas where fencing might be of benefit or whether you might need to do some control. And we might be able to assess whether that might require a public place permit. We're always seeking new grants to help us fund projects with the community. That might be for fencing or landscape scale control. We work with neighbouring councils and agencies, and so that helps us to coordinate and facilitate works across all boundaries and land tenures. And we really appreciate the work that we can do with the Yarra Catchment Forum because that is all of the Yarra Catchment, which is a massive area. And as I said, our land management incentive program should be able to help you support your property deer management, but it's important to note that we will definitely be prioritising collaborative group applications. Oops. Okay, I'll just put all of these on so that you get a chance to have a look at them. If you'd like to find out more about deer and the actions that you can take, there's a lot of things that you can do. We've got some other sessions planned as part of this project, as I mentioned, where we can go into lots more detail on fencing, monitoring and control. We're going to run some focus groups or discussion groups on how best to set up deer action groups. We'll work with, we'll workshop the peri-urban deer control issues, so investigating solutions and developing guidelines for residents and hunters as part of our community deer directory that we're putting together. We hope that soon we can have field days and do some property inspections as a group so we can look at properties together and discuss monitoring management options and see the damage and signs of deer firsthand. If we can't, then online it is. If you haven't already completed it, we're running an online deer survey, and thanks to all of those who have completed that. It's fantastic. That's on the Participate Nillumbik website. Just a quick summary of the results. They are, the full results are on the Participate Nillumbik page, but the results as of the end of July indicate that 83% of Nillumbik respondents think deer are a problem, which is almost identical to what we had today. So maybe everyone who's done the survey has come today. 6% of respondents record sightings on deer scan, so it's really low. So all those people that think they're a problem, it'd be amazing if we had 83% of Nillumbik respondents recording on deer scan. And 12% have undertaken deer control on their own property. I recommend you join a mailing list if you want to be kept informed. We've got one for deer industry as well. And we would like to get the deer management strategy released. Help us write to the Environment Minister, Lillian D'Ambrosio, to let her know that you think this is a really important issue. And finally, speak with us. Feel free to ask us any questions, but also, perhaps more importantly, provide suggestions and feedback on solutions that you've tried already. Let's solve the problem together. Okay, enough from me. I'd like to invite our panellists to turn their cameras and microphones back on so that we can hear from everybody. I might stop, actually I won't stop sharing my screen just yet because I think I've got a slide from Patricia coming up next. All right. Hello, everybody. So we do have 7 panellists here today. I can only see 6 on my screen, but that's just a dodgy thing happening there. And I'd just like to introduce each of them. We've got Patricia Gibbons, our landholder, Richard Francis from Abseco, Jake Haddad from VPAC, Mike Hall from Cardinia Deer Coalition, Arta Muchow from Middle Yarra Landcare Network, David Laird from Sporting Shooters Association, and Ash Henderson, a volunteer deer shooter. So I might hand over to Patricia first, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, and I'm going to share some images from your property.
Yep, no worries, Michelle, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining in. So as Michelle said, I'm a landowner in Nillumbik and was asked to come as a panellist on this as pretty much a representative of probably like a lot of you listening today. Don't come from a hunting background, lived in the area and now fortunate enough to own around 130 acres in Strathullan. But prior to acquiring that bit of land, of which you can see images up on the screen now, I lived in Wattle Glen on Sylvan Road, and so closer to Hurstbridge, and the deer problem was as significant there as it is out at Strathewen. So it's good to have had a bit of perspective on somewhere that's far more urban, and also out near Sugarloaf, where I'm told they were first introduced. So how fitting. So essentially, how I came about this is that we've owned this bit of land, and another landowner, maybe about 18 months ago, and he also works in Whittlesea Council, reached out to a bunch of us at Strathewen to see whether we would be open to having a professional contractors come on. That's part of that harvesting program that Michelle touched on. The one we particularly used at the time was Wild Game Resources. It's not a plug, you know, this is just my personal experience. There's probably others there. My experience with them was quite good. I guess the main thing to probably touch on is, like probably a lot of you, I had concerns about having people come onto my property I didn't know. I was concerned about how this impact my neighbours, because everyone has different views and you know, thoughts on whether it's something that should be done or shouldn't be done. Were these hunters trustworthy? You know, like I had a lot of concerns about it, but I suppose it turned out to be really good, and I had a really positive experience, and they actually ended up taking 20 deer off our property in one night. As you can see, we have quite a lot, and our property is a biolink between Sugarloaf and the rest of Strathewen, so we're one of the key properties, and certainly important that property owners are working together on this. So I don't want to take up too much time with my intro, but certainly happy to take any questions, and I think some of the ways forward of, like Michelle has mentioned, using a harvester is really good. So someone like Wild Game Resources will happily come onto your property and do an assessment and work with you. How it works is that they come out, they've done a lot of training, they've got all the accreditations. You can go on their website and have a look. As I said, there may be others as well. They then harvest the deer off your property. I know that from feedback from other neighbours, they didn't even know they knew they were there because I told them, but they actually didn't hear anything all night, which was quite good. They respect livestock and all of that. And then at the end of it, they provide income for us as landowners as a passive income for the deer that they take, which is done per kilo. But there's several options, and they don't just do deer. I noticed some comments, people talking about pigs and other things as well. So I found that really good. So overall, I've had a really positive experience. I'm quite keen to sort of, I respect native wildlife. I care about ethical shooting, all of that as well. And I think it's really great to see council and community really taking notice of how we can find the balance with you know, managing how we conserve our public land and also our private land, while also respecting, you know, that they're still a living thing and we need to do it properly and address those concerns. So yeah, happy to answer any questions going forward. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks.
Unmute. It always helps, doesn't it? Sorry about that. Let's hear from Arta from Jumping Creek or Middle Yarra. Got two hats.
I'm the facilitator for the Middle Yarra Land Care Network, and we have 6 groups, all working south of the Yarra, from Westerfold Park to the Heritage Golf Course. And they are mainly planting and weeding, all these environmental groups, the land care groups. And what we have done is to protect our plantings is from now on, or from last year, 2 years ago, we started to use only 900 millimeter high guards, or even do a lot of fencing at the moment. 2 of these groups, they have a control program running, and they contract a professional deer hunter, There are 25 landholders involved in the two groups. When the deer hunter comes to the property 2 days in advance, all the neighbors of these properties will get an SMS that the deer hunter is coming, so that everybody knows what's going on. So it's not a surprise for the neighboring landholders that suddenly there's a deer controller on the neighbor property. Of course, the deer controller, and you will hear next from the professional hunters, they have all silencers, so you hardly hear them, you hardly see them. But in addition to that control program, there is one group, the Jumping Creek Land Care Group. They have also a monitoring program, and that is was set up in 2017, where we have 40 camera traps in the field. We check these cameras every 4 months and record the sightings of deer. In addition to that, we have also 40 vegetation plots, 10 by 10 meters. There are 25 open plots and 15 exclosure plots, so that we can compare the impact of deer browsing over time with between open plots and closed plots. All that work is supported by Manningham Council, and all that monitoring work and recording work is really a mix of volunteers and Manningham Council staff.
Okay, that's great. It's a great program. You've had some really good successes with it as well, and I think it's really inspiring to see how you've all grouped together so organically and got things happening. It's really fabulous. Thanks, Arta. Richard, can I hear from you?
Hey, Michelle. So I'm from Abzico. We're a consulting and land management company, and we're one of the contracted companies working in the Sugarloaf Deer Control project. I've been undertaking deer control for a couple of decades now, and one of the reasons why we got involved in deer control was a lot of the impacts that we were noticing in conservation areas that we manage, and for Parks Victoria and councils across Greater Melbourne. And some of the landholders that we deal with in Nillumbik and elsewhere, where we've been doing biodiversity management work on private land, they were finding increasing issues with deer impacting their vegetation, changing the structure of the vegetation, impacting threatened species. We do a lot of work with threatened species, threatened flora species particularly, and those impacts were increasing rapidly. So we've been contracted by a range of interested parties to undertake that control, mainly for biodiversity management purposes. And it's one of the few options available. Obviously, we do also do fencing where that's possible, but that's not effective over large scales. I'd like to, so what you've noted, Michelle, about managing their harbour and strategic fencing, I'd like to say that that's one of the key recommendations as part of an overall property strategy that we are involved in. So managing those dense areas where deer tend to harbour, particularly spending the day, and fencing off key sites like farm dams and gully heads where possible. But fencing does impact native wildlife as well as introduce. So it's a real compromise.
I know. I was actually just going to say, what about the kangaroos and other animals that feed from them? That's why I specifically said artificial. Like, oh, I don't know how you manage that. It's all about the balance. But I like that. You're taking a holistic approach. It's not just about control, but it's about managing your property and finding the best solution for your property based on what's there.
Integrated management is really the only way. You can't be there to shoot every night.
Yeah.
And often there's not enough happening in the surrounding area to support what you're doing on your land. So it's not always available as a key option. But some of the fencing we do has a wire that's tight across the bottom, but not pinned to the ground. So the ground undulates and some fauna will get underneath that fencing, but deer don't tend to. You know, if deer do, you'll notice that straight away, and you need to actually change the fence at that location where the deer have started. We do find if kangaroos start pushing their way under, that deer will soon follow. So it's a real shame.
I definitely had those pictures of the deer pushing their way under and jumping over, because you've got both. Just like to add, is that reversed for everybody? I've got no idea. I'm looking at it in reverse here.
It's good. It's good.
Great. Stacey Warmoth, local legend. Check her out in the Deezer videos that are doing the rounds at the moment. She did this great fact sheet, which I will make sure is on our website, but it just talks about all those ins and outs of fencing. But we will also run a workshop where we can just discuss fencing together as a group and go through some of those ways that you can use fencing but not exclude other animals, or just some of the other things you need to think about, like managing build-up of litter inside your enclosure, because you are excluding all browsing animals potentially. So great little fact sheet which goes through a number of different animals and how to fence off from those, not just the deer as well. Thanks, Richard. I'll just go from what I can see on my screen. Mike Hall, are you able to tell us a little bit about what Cardinia does? Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Michelle, and great presentation. I'm very impressed as usual. And thanks everyone for turning up to show an interest, and hopefully we'll all learn something. Our group's called the Cardinia Deer Management Coalition. We were introduced early on as being farmers helping farmers, but we're not necessarily farmers. We're just local landholders, a volunteer group. Originally set up out of a concern about the damage that deer were doing to our local environment. The incursions onto private property and the damage they were doing there, danger on our roads and impact on the local rural livelihoods. So we started up as a meeting in a small room about 2 years ago, which was absolutely packed full. I had no idea until then just how much passion there was in the community. I think a really important thing that we learned from that meeting was that we had been warned that there'll be a lot of anxiety and a pushback. There is a bit, but we have noted very little. And our takeaway point is that we've been open all the way through, and it's really important to keep the channels of communication open, because everyone has a view and they all need to be heard. So our mission statement basically is to protect Cardinia Creek catchment by the humane reduction of deer numbers. And if I could make all deer infertile tomorrow, that's what I'd prefer to do. I'd rather not have to hunt, but it's the only option that we currently have. And I'll spend the rest of my time trying to find another option which is more humane. Our goals basically are to help local landowners in their goals to try and reduce deer on their own property. We also like to educate the community as to what's actually happening, because a lot of people are blissfully unaware. They see these cute little Bambis walking around. They see lots of bush around, but they're unaware of the actual true change which is happening within their bush. They don't see the loss of species, the loss of biodiversity. They just see bush. And until you actually point out to them, a lot of them are completely unaware. When they get into their garden, sure, they're aware. That's all of a sudden it becomes a big issue, but it's what's happening that you don't see, which is really, I think, the most vital. We try to establish a cooperative relationship with government and other agencies. So we're talking here about local councils. So for us, it's Cardinia, Casey and Yarra Ranges in our area. Also try to have a relationship with Parks Victoria, Melbourne Water, the local catchment authorities, because as everyone's pointed out, deer don't respect boundaries, and you really need to be able to work across tenures. If you can't work across tenures, you're really going to be struggling with this as an issue. So you need to open up neighbouring properties as you can, because often if you can't shoot on one property alone, you can shoot if you open up two properties next to each other, then that becomes a possibility. So it's really about trying to get community groups up and running. I think I heard Arta talking about that and Patricia as well. It's really important to try and get on side with your neighbours, because if you can't get your neighbours on side, you can't get going. You really need to work collaboratively. The other thing we try and do is to advocate for better deer control, because the governments have proven to be very slow in this area. I don't think they even yet appreciate just how serious a problem this is. They tend to be concentrating more on the hunter's amenity rather than the actual problem. Deer are not going to go away anytime soon. The hunters are not going to be short of some hunting, but the problem in the peri-urban area is huge.
Yeah.
And the other thing we're trying to do, which we're very new to, is trying to conduct some scientific studies to actually understand better what's happening, how we can monitor it, trying to work out what a carrying capacity actually means, which is really difficult because it's going to change from habitat to habitat.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, we've been a bit stymied. We actually got funding to do an aerial survey, which is just in the wings, so to speak, no pun intended. But unfortunately, COVID has put a hole in that. But the aerial survey hopefully will cover a significant portion of our Cardinia catchment and will give us an indication of the actual numbers that are there, because until we know the numbers that we're dealing with, we've really got no target to aim for. And there's no point in shooting deer if you don't actually have a target. If you haven't got a goal in mind, then all you're doing is just creating a recreational opportunity. And that's not really what our group is interested in.
Yeah.
If I'm taking too long, just say, but our initial target really was, because we were so concerned about what was already happening, we've been concentrating hard on trying to be matchmakers with local property owners. We're not hunters. We're more like a matchmaker. So a property owner will contact us. We have a list of what we call our preferred hunters, who are people who have got good skills, who've got good references, who've got good communication skills, who've got the right weapons and the right licenses. And we'll put the property owners in contact with the controllers, who will hopefully do the job for them. We give the owners information about the legalities of operating on private land, because a lot of people are still unaware of that, and that's not a surprise. When they do want to engage a hunter, what they can expect of a hunter, what the hunter should expect of them, what to do with carcass control, as you mentioned before, Michelle. Yeah,
Might get you to write my little management plan then and guidelines. Sounds like you've done all the hard work for us.
There's so much to learn about this area that we're learning all the time and changing all the time.
Yeah.
It's just a huge area, and I think that's why I like to go to these sorts of things, because every time you go to one of these things, you learn more.
Yep.
So our next phase is really to try and do more scientific work. We haven't been able to concentrate on that yet because of COVID, but the aerial survey hopefully will come up soon. And we'll get a better idea of just how serious the problem is, because it's just the unknown that's the elephant in the room. We know it's a problem, but we don't know how much of a problem. We don't know what our targets yet are. So that's our group.
That sounds great. And yeah, I was trying to get involved with your aerial survey as well, and we certainly had issues with the density of vegetation preventing, or maybe it wasn't your project, but a similar one. The vegetation can be a real impediment to getting some good thermal survey results. Having said that, I did see a little note pop up that Nillumbik should think about doing that. I have in fact just put out a request for quote for a couple of different companies to see if we can organise some aerial surveys of Nillumbik. I've just tried to prioritise some areas to begin with, and we'll see how much it costs and how much we can get done.
One of the participants is Rob Matthews, who's one of the pilots involved. So if you want to ask him about canopy cover and will thermal imaging work through canopy cover, he can give you some answers to that.
Yep, have most definitely spoken to him. Thanks for the tip. All right, there was a couple of comments about recreational hunters there, which makes me think maybe I'll throw to David Laird at this point, the Sporting Shooters Association. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, David Laird, Hunting Development Manager at SSAA Victoria. I've been a deer hunter for over 30 years now. I was also a commercial deer farmer for 15, venison processor for 10 years as well. So got a fair bit of experience dealing with deer from a number of different perspectives. In my current role, I'm obviously represent the association and responsible for our control programs on deer, along with a few other bits and pieces. I'll talk about them in a sec, but probably a couple of general points first, if I can. From what we've heard so far, you might think that deer are the font of all evil. They're not. I mean, there are a lot of really positive aspects about deer as well. They're a highly regarded game species and recreational resource. They're a magnificent animal in their own right. And obviously hunting has a big impact on the Victorian economy. I think in 2013, the last sort of accurate figures we had, it was worth $57 million, and that's significantly increased since then because the number of hunters have increased as well. In 2018, there was 121,000 deer shot in Victoria, and they're the latest figures that we have available by recreational hunters, and that was 39,000 licensed hunters who contributed that. And the reality is that the deer are here to stay, regardless of what anyone wants. So we do have to deal with them, we have to manage them. And that's where SSAA Victoria, sort of our view is, we want to see deer managed as a sustainable recreational resource. But what we also recognise is where they are having damage, or creating damage, they do need to be managed appropriately. And I think the key point is management is not necessarily just about control. That control is a part of that overall management. So I think it was important that Michelle mentioned before about there are 6 species in Victoria supposedly. Realistically, we've got 4 species established in the wild in Victoria. And it's important that when we're talking about deer management, that we understand that they all have different impacts and different effects and need different sort of management techniques. So it's very easy for people to just talk about deer management and tend to forget about that as well. Our view is for deer to be sustainable in Victoria, the population densities have to be kept within the carrying capacity of whatever the environment is in the particular area. In some cases, that carrying capacity might be relatively high. In other cases, it might be absolutely zero. So it just depends. So we certainly recognise that where deer are having those negative impacts, they do need to be managed and controlled. And that's where we have a couple of programs where we're actually involved in deer control. We have 2, and this is probably where most people watching this are probably interested in this side of things. We run a conservation and pest management program. That's more a formalised program in partnership with Parks Victoria on public land, so national parks, state parks, areas controlled by Parks Victoria. So we control all sorts of pest species, and we also are involved in deer control on that. It's a highly regulated program. There's a really high level of accreditation for our volunteers, and Parks Victoria are very much involved in the operations of those. In Nillumbik, there might be opportunities for that sort of program to work on some of the public land there. Probably the one that's most relevant for landowners is our Farmer Assist program, and that's more like a matchmaking service. So we basically provide a portal for landowners to put up their jobs. We call them jobs. So if they've got a problem with deer, they put up there. The landowner controls the whole process. So they say what the job is, what they require out of it, when they want shooters to come, what sort of qualifications they want them to have, whether they want them to come during the day and hunt or whether they want them at night. So basically the farmer sets the job, and then our volunteers respond to that and volunteer to do it. Then the farmer goes through the process and can have a look and vet those people. He can then email them back. It's all confidential, so the participants don't get the farmer's details, but the farmer can then correspond with them through that portal, ask some questions and choose the appropriate people for that job. So all our volunteers in all our programs are insured, covered by $20 million public liability insurance, which is really important. And we also have just our regular volunteers, or our regular members are covered by public liability insurance as well. So that's outside the sort of accredited programs, but they might well offer their services if somebody knows them, and that's fine. I will sort of reinforce what you said before, Michelle. It's all volunteer based. our insurance does not cover any commercial operations at all. So if any of our members were to turn up and say they want a payment, that's not covered, and that's not what our volunteer programs are about at all. So just important that people understand that one.
I wonder, David, whether we might, can I cut in there? Because I just noticed the time, and we need to get some questions. So I'm going to ask poor Jake and Ashley to have like, I don't know, 30 seconds. Then we can get on to answering some of the questions from our guests, because I think that's probably why we are here today. Look, they're both ready to go. Jake.
Yep. Hello, everybody. Thanks for attending. I'm Jake from Victorian Pest Animal Control. We're professional deer controllers that are working with local council and various jobs around Victoria for Parks Victoria as well. We do a little bit of stuff with like blood sampling, DNA, stuff like that. You know, basically our objective is, as a business, the safest and most productive method to ethically, you know, dispatch and remove deer from our operations areas. So we actually respect these animals a lot and recognise that they are, you know, reserved as a game species, but in areas where they're a problem, you know, it's our job to go in there and do that problem and do it professionally with respect and you know, continuing that ethical process for shooting and removing these animals. You know, just briefly, some of the issues that we can face is, you know, access to different areas, and it can be difficult to retrieve and harvest these animals, as Michelle's explained. We like to do a lot of community engagement and in as much as possible create a positive view of our approach and how we're doing things. You know, the last thing I wanted to touch on, and I often get asked, is just the difference between hunting and culling. So, you know, basically, if you're hunting, I guess there's fair chase and maybe some head hunting and stuff like that involved. We are just here to basically use the best methods and equipment to safely and productively remove as many animals as we can. And, you know, that's the job. It's not something that we're trying to push. It's just what we do for our clients, and that's pretty much it. Okay,
awesome. And last but not least, Ash Henderson.
How you going, everyone? Thanks, Michelle. Look, I've been a recreational hunter for the last 10 years. I'm affiliated with a number of hunting associations. For several years, I've been involved in the Conservation Pest Management Program with the SSAA. Also been involved in control of a number of private property, deer control in a number of private properties. Methods we use depends, you know, on terrain. We use hides, sit and wait methods. On foot, day, night, we use night vision and thermal vision to stop, you know, a lot of people get upset, or neighbours, with lights flashing around, and, you know, and we go through all we contact neighbours and landowner before we step on, have all the right paperwork signed. Yeah, and everyone else has sort of touched on everything else I was going to talk about. I don't have much left to say because everyone's...
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Yeah, I think you just need to answer any Kelly questions, or, you know, what issues you have as a recreational shooter. So that's totally fine. That's all we need. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Kirsten, I guess you need to pop back on and tell us who wants to know what from all this stuff that they've just heard.
Thanks for all that, guys. We've got some great questions. My first question for possibly Jake and Ashley. Are there any rules for landholders as to how to dispose of carcasses and deer on private property that's not been harvested? And if a deer is shot but not killed and they stray off that property?
I'll take this if you like. The rules are, as I understand it at the moment, that is, the deer is... Are you talking about if they're shot by the landowner or by the harvester? That's the question. If they're shot by the landowner, then, you know, they can be shot and left on site. If they're shot by the harvester, they can be shot and left on site. If they are shot and injured And, you know, this is something that rarely happens with us because we basically shoot to anchor, which means that they will be dispatched and die like in the position that they're shot at. If they are shot and they travel on to another property, then the process would be that you would absolutely 100% have to contact the owner of that property and let them know that you are, you know, you need to enter that property to retrieve that deer, because obviously you just can't let an injured deer sort of wander onto a property next door. So there's always compliance in regards to that, if that's the answer to the question. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Okay, I've got some questions here about fencing. So maybe Richard and maybe any others that have any comments. What's the point of having fencing if they can jump a 2 or 3 metre fence?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Generally, with fencing, you're targeting specific areas within a larger land unit. You don't always fence the whole of an area. So what you're trying to do is make it more difficult for deer to enter an area. So they will avoid that area. They generally won't jump a high fence unless they have a really good reason to. It's not something they do regularly to get in and out of somewhere. So it's about modifying their behaviour. It won't exclude all deer all of the time, but they will certainly take the easier option most of the time and avoid that area.
Yeah. I heard a good phrase, sorry, I just heard a good phrase, which was if they can see around it, they'll go around it. Hence why I suggested they should be small areas, not ones,
And the other thing that we found, if you put shade cloth over the fence and make it so they can't visually see through it as well, even a lower fence can really deter deer. And we've used that on a number of sites. Sorry, go on.
From a deer farming perspective, most of your external fences would be 1.9 metres high, and very seldom would you get deer jump that unless they were really pressured or they really wanted to get there. A lot of deer farms go to internal fences that are only 1.5 metres high, and once again, unless the deer really wants to go over it, that's generally adequate for internal fences. Obviously, that's you want to keep deer in a deer farm, you want to keep them out of your farm, but just even standard stock fences can be amended and made a little bit higher, and especially with some electric fences can make a big difference because deer, if they don't have to, and if it makes it a bit harder for them and they've got other options, they'll go somewhere else.
Thank you. There's some other fencing questions, so I'm going to sort of ask them all at once. Annie has asked about whether you can please advise about preventing deer from drinking from dam walls that are vulnerable to damage. Currently, the deer hoof holes are creating holes and erosion and dam leaks.
Yeah, I think you're in the same boat. You're going to either have to put fencing to exclude them from that area, and then that's potentially excluding your stock as well. Or you can try some scent deterrents, but they're not necessarily going to work, not necessarily going to last long. But if you've got a consistent problem there, I think fencing around those strategic sort of assets is probably going to be your best way to go.
And what if that's not a practical option?
Well, then you go back to some of your other management and control and try and move the deer onto somewhere else or put pressure on them through some of your hunting activities and things like that. Look, it's an extremely complicated area and often opens up a can of worms as to how you deal with these things. And you might solve your problem, but then the neighbour's got a problem and so it goes on, which is why, as a general point, a lot of this deer control needs to be done over as large area as possible. Because deer will often be living on one property and then travelling and feeding on another property, creating damage on those properties. So that's why it's much more preferable to deal with this on a broader scale and try and alleviate the problems for everybody in that particular area.
Has anyone on the panel had any experience of using a lattice of old car tyres or some other type of barrier like that near the water to try and deter the deer from using that side of the dam wall?
Cattle grates can work, but that's not going to be effective for this site. It's really only fencing. You can't fence on a wall usually. You have to fence below the wall. That's
okay.
about it.
Interesting idea, though. I'd love somebody to try that out and let us know. Maybe that is, yeah, an obstacle to deer because they don't want to walk over that.
It'll be a deterrent.
Yeah.
But,
yeah, they're
if
desperate.
they really want to get there, they'll get there. Yeah, they're pretty sure.
I suppose what you've really got to consider is the extent of the damage. I mean, it's fine to say they're damaging it, but is it damage to the stage where it's contaminating the water? Or is it damage where it's affecting the integrity of the dam, or is it just some hoof marks there that aren't going to really have a major impact? And this is when we talk about deer damage. I mean, how significant is that damage in the broad scale of things? Because there's damage to a whole lot of things. Some of it we're just going to have to accept. And then we're going to have to mitigate some of the more important things. So I can't really answer that, but maybe that's something to consider as a more general sort of scenario as well.
Fantastic. And just to follow up to the first question that we had, Gay has asked, I thought carcasses had to be buried on properties if they were not being removed for harvesting purposes. Is that not correct?
Yeah, hi Gay. It's an agreement between you and the landowner. They don't necessarily have to be buried if they're left in situ on site. They can be, but I don't believe it's a requirement.
It can
they should be.
Because, yeah, the EPA is more sort of involved in that side of things. It's like dead stock left on places. If you've got a huge area of land, you can probably get away with it. If you've got a couple of acres, it's probably a different situation. And
Yeah.
Once again, this is another one of the complicating factors. You can say, yeah, we'll control deer and we'll shoot deer, but then you've got carcasses or you've got guts and you've got all these other sort of things that you've then got to deal with. So it's challenging. There's no real simple answers. Everything leads on to something else, and you've got to consider a whole heap of other things.
Yeah.
And it's just following on that theme one more time. What about near waterways? Is there any different practices, best practice?
Yeah, definitely around waterways. Deer are removed and not left around waterways at all. And our guidelines, again, like David said, it is a case-by-case basis and it does lead to other questions, but this is just a general rule that any deer will not be left within 50 metres of a waterway or a water catchment area.
Yeah, and sometimes you have access issues, but that's the usual rule. You get in there, if you need to, take it out in sections. So, standard practice.
I've got a question here around pasture management, which I'll read out, but I will also say that we have got on our team that works at council a land management officer that specialises in pasture management. And so I might suggest that anyone that has any concerns around or questions around similar to this one, that they get in contact with our land management officer. If you contact council and just ask to be put through to council's land management officer, you'll speak to Stephanie and she's great. But this question is, how can you have good regenerative agriculture grazing practices if unable to control all grazing animals? So that's including rabbits, kangaroos and deer from eating new growing ground cover and pasture. So please give Stephanie a call, our land management officer. She's a specialist in that and she can provide you with some tailored advice and she can visit you at your property and talk through some of those options.
I'll just say my experience, for anyone that's wondering, my experience with Stephanie, and because I'm very keen to be doing regenerative farming and pasture management on my property, and I've found, that ability to come and do site visits, COVID restrictions notwithstanding, really beneficial. And certainly I've had Melbourne Water come out on site and talk about stream frontage programs because we have quite a significant stream and dam system through our property. So I've had involved with Melbourne Water, Wild Game Resources, Council Environment Officer, and I think collaboratively, when you put key infrastructure, you can take advantage of some of the grants and expert advice. I think if you have a holistic program, I think that will probably help a lot of people resolve some of these issues rather than just, one single approach. It helps if you're doing a number of things. But yeah, I found Steph to be really good in council, and that's from a member in the community. So yeah, it's been good.
Thanks, Patricia. I've just noticed that Stephanie has popped up onto the screen. Are you there, Steph? you want to just introduce yourself and say hi? No. All right.
Hello,
Oh,
sorry. I when I log in as this login, anyway, technical issue. But what I would say about pasture with deer or roos or any browsing pressure that you don't have control of the way you have control of livestock would be you roughly know how much deer pressure or roo pressure you have. Yes, it does increase over time or decrease over time, but you can roughly allow for it within your rotation. So generally with your livestock, if you know certain paddocks have very high roo browsing or deer browsing, you might say, well, in other areas in exclusion paddocks, my total recovery time needs to be, say, 4 months, because when I take the stock out, it's allowed to recover. But when we have add deer pressure or roo pressure, might need to be extended out to, say, 8-9 months. And that is the best way I've found so far in allowing for other grazing pressures with our stock and getting those regenerative outcomes.
thanks, Steph. So if anyone would like to find out some more, contact Stephanie directly and she can talk you through it. Okay, my next question is to Jake and Richard, really, around what are the costs of using a professional operator?
You can have that one, Jake.
Can I answer it on behalf? Can I answer it on behalf?
Yeah, that's probably a good idea.
It's vastly variable depending on the contractor and how they operate, whether they run other businesses and are dependent on it for their income stream. I think that's important to note, because it's done at night, they might have a daytime job. But regardless, I've seen prices anywhere from, on an hourly rate, $50 an hour to $250 an hour. So it's it depends on the operator, and that's probably comes down to what they have equipment-wise, their techniques that they can use, or their experience. So yeah, you need to just shop around.
The property will influence that as well, how productive you can be. So it's a really complex one to answer, and it depends also what your objectives are. So you'd have to, the only way we can really measure cost is on a productivity basis. So how many do you get per hour? And that will be influenced by a number of factors.
Yeah, I agree. Yep.
Having the I did the harvesting option, obviously having wild game resources come to me as a landowner, not contracted, on behalf of council or anything. I didn't pay for that. If anything, actually, I got, not that I do it for money, but it was a good incentive that once they harvested it, I got probably a few $100s out of when it's a per kilo rate. And then I put that money back into other things on my property to help, with fencing and other things. So just as another option as well. And I also have a neighbour come and help do it in his spare time. So.
As an initial knockdown, you can sometimes do harvesting on some properties.
Yeah, I'd like to.
Fortunately, it's not always cost effective, and I'm sure Jake will reiterate that.
Yeah, that's right. What Richard's saying is, I'm sure on your property, Patricia, where they were able to knock over, 10 or 20 deer in a night, then that's definitely an option. And this is why Richard was saying before, it varies greatly from property to property, because, if there's only, if it's a small site and you might only be able to knock over 1 or 2 animals in the night, well, then it's not profitable from a harvesting perspective. So other avenues need to be explored.
Yeah. And it very quickly becomes unprofitable anyway. Yeah.
And that's where your volunteers come in. I mean, there's a place for the commercial guys. I mean, they've got their place, but there's also a place for the volunteers, and they're effectively paying for the privilege. They're supplying all their own equipment and ammunition, and they're just happy to come out and utilise their sort of hunting and shooting skills to help out landowners. So, that's always a really good option. And I know some landowners are sort of a bit reluctant for people they don't know, but that's why programs where we're dealing with accredited shooters who have gone through that process and who are backed by an organisation and have got that insurance, landowners can have that bit more confidence and be more comfortable in dealing with people.
I agree with what David's saying there. I think that's a good point. There is a good fit for every property. Some properties, the access might not be great for volunteers. Some properties are exactly on point for what David was saying. They're ideal for volunteers. They might be a little bit further out where they're allowed to operate and can be effective. And I agree that the costs can be prohibitive for some landowners, and a lot of the contracts that we're involved in are government based, and probably for that reason. But there is, that's a very good point. There's definitely a place for volunteer shooters for some landowners, as long as it's all managed correctly and the shooters know what they're doing. Definitely, yes.
I have a related question, which is around populous place permits. When do you need to get a populous place permit, and how does that affect what type of shooting might be allowed?
That's a good question, Kirsten, because it's not clear. It isn't clear. Some people will say it's based on the size of the property, but the best way that I could put it is that you might have a 100-acre property out in a rural area, and then you wouldn't require a populous permit for that. But if you had a 100-acre property in the centre of Melbourne, well, 100% you would. And it really, I know it's difficult, but it really comes down to sort of having a bit of a look at the property, having a look at what is around the property. Are you in an urban area, peri-urban area, rural area? And then, if there's any uncertainty at all, to contact the DFO, which is the District Firearms Office for that area, and have them determine whether a populous permit is required or not.
Yep, 100% agree with you. And when we have a workshop that focuses on if you want to do deer control on your property, we will be involving the District Firearms Officer in that, if at all possible. Is that right, Michelle?
Yep, absolutely. Just can't be on Zoom, so we'll find another medium. But he will definitely be able to answer those questions. But having said that, he can give advice, but every property is different. So if he's got any queries or concerns, he'd absolutely do a site inspection to work out whether it's appropriate or not.
Yeah, they're really great. Okay, is it possible, there's two similar questions. Is it possible to entice deer into a trap and then dispose of that animal? And I also have had an earlier question, is anyone investigating the use of fence-based enclosures or traps to improve the efficiency of culling? For example, corralling the deer on properties in preparation for hunters to then be able to remove them.
I would say, and this is just my opinion, that it's very, very difficult to corral deer. Some species are probably more easy than others, like the herding species such as fallow and reds. I don't think you're going to have much hope in trying to corral Sambar at all, so they'd be completely off the list. And then in regards to fallow and red, if someone could do it, I'd like to see it, because it's not an easy thing. There's a lot of factors that would be involved in doing that. I'm not saying it's impossible, but certainly maybe some deer species, if they're in a tightly packed herd and all the planets align at the time, possibly yes. Whether it's a productive way of doing it, moving across all species in all areas, maybe not. Richard might have something to offer on this as well. And
I'm sure Dave would too, David Laird. The stress involved and the behaviour of the deer when they're corralled that has been a big issue for the deer farming industry. When you're moving deer on a deer farm, it has to be really quiet. I'm sure David could explain, but it's a very difficult thing to achieve, and deer will at those times jump high fences if they get spooked, particularly wild deer. And if you put something above, like you have a cage above, they'll tend to hit their heads on that and break their necks. They're not well suited to trapping or herding in any way. Big challenge for deer farms. Sorry, David, I'm sure you want to add to that.
Yeah, no, you're spot on there. And even on the farm, I farmed and I had a really well-designed laneway system and paddocks so that the deer would flow out of the paddocks, and really substantial yards with very high, solidly constructed walls and facilities there. So to actually build some corrals out on a farm situation, not really practical, because to make them strong enough to hold the deer, to get the deer in there. Then you have got your issues of stress. I mean, even with farm deer, you had to be careful with stress, and we selected very heavily on temperament. One or two sort of flighty deer in a farm situation can cause havoc, let alone dealing with completely wild deer. So technically, potentially could be done, but yeah, not realistically, I wouldn't think in most situations. Just too many problems.
Thanks, David. Michelle, in peri-urban areas, is there a size of property requirement before shooting is allowed?
Well, again, that's a question related to the public place permit, but you won't find anything in any of the firearms regulations or acts about distance from houses, size of property. It's kind of a common sense thing of where is it actually safe, and it all depends on which direction the firearm is aimed. You can stand right next to a house and shoot and it'd be perfectly safe if you're pointing the firearm in the opposite direction. And it's all about the topography of the land. If you've got a safe backstop, you could have a tiny property that's got a hill that, you know.
Sure. So again, we can cover that in a special workshop where we'll go into all of those.
Yeah.
If I can just add something here, as a professional contractor, the system, the way it works is that we have a rolling populous place permit, which allows us to shoot on any property as long as we have verbal sign-off from the local district's firearms officer. As a recreational shooter, without that rolling place permit, then you are required to obtain a populous place, or public place, I should say, public place permit for each individual site.
So it's safe if you can demonstrate that it is safe to undertake the activity, then it's permitted, even with our annual public place permit that covers us across all of Victoria. The onus is still on us to demonstrate that we can undertake these works safely. And on a very small property, you may be able to achieve an elevated position so that you're taking a shot on an angle to the ground, so you have a safe backstop. And if you can do that, then any property potentially could be safe. But if you've got lots of small properties around, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be affected by the noise of the firearms, and that's also taken into consideration. It may not be appropriate because of that effect of the sound of a firearm, even if it can be done safely. So there's a number of things we have to take into consideration.
Yeah.
Those properties. Sorry.
So I was just going to say, practically speaking, there are some properties that it's just not going to be feasible to discharge a firearm on for whatever reason. So, and that's why you try and look at the broader picture around that area. So the deer might be coming in and having an impact on that property, but they're coming from another property. So if you can't control them there, have a look at the bigger picture and see that you might be able to control them somewhere else. I've seen some of the comments. The Australian Bowhunters Association put in a little bit about using bow hunters, and look, that's potentially a feasible option there. Once again, you'd want to be dealing with a reputable organisation with insurance for their members, but yeah, bow hunting could well be a really effective way in some of those smaller areas. There's no sound of the shot. They potentially become elevated, so they're shooting down into the ground. So there's a number of different sort of options. Shooting is not going to be the solution to these issues in every situation. It just won't work like that.
I want to add one more thing about the bow hunting is that the Governor and Council unprotection order, so that allowing the control at night, that does not cover bow hunting. So if you were doing that, it would need to be daytime, which is probably fine, but just to make sure people are aware that that can't happen at night.
Yeah, it's not something that we would ever do because, of course, the animals, it's difficult to obtain a swift and effective death. And they can become a hazard. No, it's on a percentage basis, it's very difficult. But anyway, we won't discuss that. I won't debate it.
I'm not here representing bow hunting, but I do know a little bit about it. So anyway, we'll move on.
Okay, it's 4 o'clock, which is officially our finish time. So Michelle, do you want to quickly do your poll? And then, as I said earlier, we're happy to stay on for a few minutes longer, but we will formally, I guess, finish and thank everyone who came along and listened today. If you have any follow-up questions, please don't please don't hesitate to get into contact with Michelle Hanslow. You can email her at environment@nillumbik.vic.gov.au, and she can follow up with you. Michelle's going to just ask you to fill in a quick poll, and then once that's done, we'll stay on. We'll answer a few more questions, but I do appreciate that a lot of people will have to leave, and I thank you very much for coming and listening to us today. It looks like we've got around 80% have answered or now, and we thank you for just giving us that feedback. That'll be really useful for us as we plan our future work. Is there anyone on the panel that knows where you can buy venison?
Occasionally from the supermarket. But the Victoria market's where I used to get it in the past.
Okay.
Some of the farmers markets have got people, but it's not readily available.
Yeah.
We're not allowed to sell it as game harvesters to anyone other than an abattoir, so unfortunately.
Okay. Does anyone have any intel around what's happening inside the Melbourne Water fence? Or do we need to take that on notice and it's up to Melbourne Water? The question is around, or it's not really a question, it's more a statement. Sugarloaf is fenced. It's no wonder it's overrun. It's probably full of foxes and feral cats too. Does anyone have any remarks on that?
It's only partially fenced. There's only a normal far fence on the western side. So although it looks to the public like it's got this big cyclone fence around it, there are some areas out of view where it backs onto private land where the fence is just a farm fence. That
I didn't want to scare people with that.
Walk through every night. I've watched them.
Yeah.
Yes.
As part of my project, Melbourne Water are undertaking fox control. They are also undertaking some weed control, and the deer control at Sugarloaf, I would need to double check, but I'm pretty sure it's scheduled to begin next financial year. So they do plan on doing something with that. I'm just looking at the poll, 98% of people have voted, and oh look, I'm glad you're going to share what you've learned today. That's fantastic. We've got, I'll see if I can share this with people, share results. Yeah, the biggest one is tell people what you've learned, and I highly appreciate that. Lots of people here today, but lots of people that would still need perhaps to know what's going on, the fact that there is some problems with the deer in the area, and getting them to look around, see what they can see, and letting us know would be incredibly helpful. A few people wanting to take some workshops and try some deterrents, and and report deer sightings on Deer Scan. Thank you very much. If those people all do that, then I'll be very happy. Okay.
Does anyone in the panel know whether there are is any deer control happening around? It's just left near Laughing Waters Road, or Laughing Waters Park.
I don't think there's any official programs going on, but there's a number of landholders in that area who are having private control happening. But look, if anyone's got specific issues in that area and you and your neighbours are all having issues, talk to us. We are happy to send one of our contractors out to have a look at your property. Our land management officer can come out, and if you're backing on to Parks Victoria, some of those properties are, we can have that conversation with Parks Victoria also, and see if we can develop some strategies, or get a little group going in that area to undertake some control or fencing. Yep.
I think that's a really great segue into just reiterating that Council is very happy to help groups of neighbours to work together to control deer. So if you lived in that area or in any other area and you wanted to band together with your neighbours to help control deer, as we've all heard today, if you can control deer across multiple properties, you're more likely to get success, and it's more economically feasible if you're paying for it, that is. And you may find that you have a property which is not suitable for deer control, but your neighbours do. So if you work together, you can get better outcomes. So we'd encourage you to look at our collaborative deer web page. Do you want to give that a spruik, Michelle?
Oh, am I not sharing my page? Am I sharing my screen?
Yes, you are. Sorry,
oh,
you
good.
are.
Great. So
it's up.
Oh, good. Technical issues.
Over.
Okay. Yeah. So the website is up there, but if you just search for Collaborative Deer Nillumbik, you'll find the web page. As I said, we'll update that as we have more information, and we'll put up new workshops there that we'll be running, and contact details for us to talk to you about starting those collaborative groups.
Fantastic. There's a question here. Someone asked how many people attended today's session. One time when I looked, there were 272. At the moment, there's 93.
Well, you can't keep people's attention forever. It's been a long session and a lot of talking.
Yeah. Evelyn's asked whether we're keeping a deer that are being killed within Nillumbik. And I will say that, yes, we are keeping a tally of the deer that are being controlled under Nillumbik Shire Council's programs. What we don't know is how many are being controlled by private landholders or landowners on their own properties, either themselves or using their own professionals or volunteer shooters. And we would really like to know. We would really like to know about what's happening.
Yeah, it'd be incredibly helpful, because then we can understand better why we don't have big numbers in an area. It might be because there's already control happening in those sites. So even if you don't have to put it on deer scan, but that would be great. But if you can let us know, yeah, that'll help us not start contacting your properties to offer deer control that's already happening.
Yeah. So guys, we might end there.
I was just going to, very quickly say, just from a community perspective, I know that out there, no offence to the council people here, that a lot of people are generally really hesitant to involve themselves in any council initiatives because they're worried that council's going to come on and, I don't know, that they get confused with the planning and issues that they may have had previously. But I just want to say that I've actually had nothing but positive experiences so far, and it shouldn't be something landowners are decide not to participate in just because they're concerned, because I don't think necessarily it's, maybe it was well founded previously, but certainly I've had nothing but positive experiences. I'm not getting paid by council to say this either. So yeah, just from someone in the community, that I know that's sometimes a concern, that people are a bit protective over having people come on their land. So yeah.
Thanks, Patricia, and thank you to everyone on our panel and to Michelle. We really appreciate your involvement, and thank you to everyone that's come along to listen to us today.
Yeah, we'll send you out the slides once they're ready. Cool.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you, Kirsten.
Amazing.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, might press the leave button. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
No
you.
worries. That was really good.
No worries.
Thanks.
I think I might need to press end meeting. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.